Well, it's Palm Sunday, in case you hadn't guessed that. And we are working our way through a series as a church, actually looking from the Last Supper on what we call Maundy Thursday, the Last Supper through to the death and then the resurrection of Jesus. And we've looked at that over the last few weeks and are working our way through. And today we're going to be looking at the trials of Jesus that happened to him very early on what we call Good Friday morning. But just before we do that, I'm going to quickly just jump back to Palm Sunday and what we call the triumphal entry into Jerusalem, where, as Pastor Dominic has already said, that the crowd shouted, "Blessed is the King who comes." The King. There was a shout of praise. This was a radical shift in Jesus' ministry. Up to this point, Jesus has been traveling around largely in the backwaters and some of the more rural parts of Israel. He's generally tended to avoid major population centers. Yes, he's drawn large crowds. He's fed the 5,000. He's preached the Sermon on the Mount. But generally speaking, he has avoided some of the real opportunities to interact with the great power of that time, Rome. Whereas we get to Palm Sunday and something changes. Jesus goes really public with his ministry, but it moves more than just being about individuals. He moves it to being about a declaration of a kingdom. And Jesus riding into Jerusalem as the king was really provocative to the kingdoms that were already there. You see, the nation of Israel were expecting, or were hoping and longing for a king to come. Not the king we're going to hear about later in the story, but a king that was called, the name that was used, was Messiah. Now, that's a term we are well used to using as Christians. We talk about Jesus as our Messiah. But what did that mean to the Jewish people in Jerusalem on that first Easter? Well, the Hebrew word there, Mashiach, means anointed one, which is great, but that doesn't really mean a huge amount, does it? So over the centuries, a whole lot of things had been attached to this word, some of which were rooted in prophecy and scriptures, the Hebrew scriptures, what we call the Old Testament, some of which were just culturally added. And so we end up with a whole load of expectations of a Messiah who is going to be a leader raised up in the line of King David, who would bring physical deliverance to the nation of Israel from their Gentile enemies, restore the temple, reestablish the rule of King David. He would be a military and a political leader who would lead an army and rule as king. And there was no sense that this would be anything to do with God coming to earth. This was a human leader. So when they were thinking of Messiah triumphally entering into Jerusalem, this picture is what they were thinking of. This is what they were thinking. A military leader sitting on a horse leading an army. Instead, this is what they got. Jesus riding on a donkey, a foolish animal. This was not the sign of a great military leader. And that is really important as we come to look at the trials of Jesus now, because Jesus does not come as the world expected him to come. Jesus comes proclaiming a different kingdom. So, before we jump into the story, it's important to say that this is about our faith becoming public. Our world has a very particular idea of faith, that it's very personal. And our world today, and our world then, probably in first century, would have said the same thing. Faith is about you and God. I don't know whether you have talked to your friends or colleagues or relationships or relations or anything like that, and talked about your faith, and they said, oh, well, that's great for you. That's lovely for you. As if, don't expect me to get involved. And our politically, I don't know if you remember, some of you may have been around in the UK when the last Labour government back in 1997 came to power, and there was this big thing that Tony Blair, the leader of the Labour Party, said, we don't do God. And that sort of set up this idea that, or made public this idea that faith is a private thing. Don't make it mention anything to do with how that would affect how we live our lives, how our governments rule our countries. Don't talk about that. Well, the triumphal entry says, no, faith is public. You see, our faith is intensely personal, but it is not private. It is public. Our faith is always a public faith. So, let's fast forward now. And we're now on Good Friday, early in the morning. Jesus has been arrested and is being dragged in front of three trials over the course of a few hours. So before we read the actual scriptures, we're going to look at the characters. Because you see, quite often we read these scriptures and we don't actually understand who the people are involved in these stories. So there are three people, or two people and one group of people, that we're going to look at who oversee these trials. First of all, there's what in your translation it may call the Council of Elders. In some translations, it'll give it its Hebrew name, which is the Sanhedrin. And it is the supreme judicial body of the Jewish people. In some of the other translations, in the Luke version we're going to read, it doesn't mention names, but in some of the other Gospels, it does mention names. Two that come up were Caiaphas, who was the current high priest at the time, and Annas, who was the previous high priest, also happened to be Caiaphas's father-in-law. It sounds like EastEnders, doesn't it? It's a bit of a soap opera going on here. But we don't know a huge amount about the Sanhedrin. For example, we know it was made up of either 23 or 71 members. Now, that's a big difference, isn't it? We'd have thought we would have known that, but historians haven't been able to decide fully on that. So that's the first group of people we're going to talk about. That's the first trial. Then Jesus is taken in front of Pontius Pilate. We've heard his name lots when we read the Easter story. But who was he? Well, he was the procurator of Judea. Posh name, that. Basically, it means he's the governor. He's the boss. He represents Rome. And Rome is the power at this time. They hold military, political, and every other type of control over a significant chunk of the known world, of which Israel, unfortunately, is a backwater. It's a middle of nowhere part of the Roman Empire. It really only serves a role as a land route between Rome and Greece round to Egypt, which was considered far more important to the Romans than Israel was. It was a backwater. That will become important when we figure out how Pilate handles his trial, the trial of Jesus. We don't know very much about Pilate at all. He couldn't have been anyone significant because he was sent to the backwater. He was probably a former soldier. and probably from the Roman middle classes. And that would have given him the right to a political posting, and he gets sent to Israel, to Judea. Third person in this saga is King Herod. King Herod Antipas. That's not antipasta. That's an Italian starter. No, it's Antipas. And he was the tetrarch of Galilee and Perea. Now, for those of you, that's not a little game you play on your phone where the little blocks drop. That's Tetris. This is tetrarch. What's tetrarch? It's a posh word. What happened was, you see, I'll come to that in a moment. This King Herod is not the King Herod we hear of in the Christmas story. If you know your British history, you know we've had lots and lots of King Georges. Well, King Herod was the equivalent in Israel's monarchy. It was the name that everyone seemed to have. So King Herod from the Christmas story was known as King Herod the Great. Very modest and humble man, you can clearly see. And he was the one who did the massacre of the innocents, who misled the wise men, and he ruled over Israel. And shortly after the Christmas story, he died. And in his will, and the Roman authorities agreed, because it helped them, it was agreed to divide the kingdom into 4 parts. Tetra is the Greek for 4. You can impress your friends with that one. So therefore, Herod Antipas oversaw 1/4 of the kingdom of Israel. We use the name Antipas simply to define him because, yes, there's another one. His brother, King Herod Agrippa, looked after another part of the kingdom. So it was split between 4 children of Herod the Great, of which Herod Antipas was the youngest and the most immature of all of them. And the thing to remember is he was appointed by the Roman rulers. You see, he's not a real anointed king of Israel. He's an appointed king by the occupying forces. So there we go. Those are the characters. So let's jump into the passage now. We're going to start in Luke's Gospel, chapter 22, and verse 66 is where we're going to start. It says this: At daybreak, the council of the elders of the people, both the chief priests and the teachers of the law, met together, and Jesus was led before them. If you are the Messiah, they said, tell us. Jesus answered, if I tell you, you will not believe me. And if I asked you, you would not answer. But from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the Almighty God. And they all asked, are you then the Son of God? He replied, you say that I am. Then they said, why do we need any more testimony? We have heard it from his own lips. You see, so this is the first of Jesus' trials. He's taken before the Sanhedrin, and they ask him, if he's the Messiah. So they're interested in the Jewish concept of Messiah. Is he this ruler, this human being, this king who's going to come and lead the people? Now, let you into a little secret. They're really not interested in the real answer. They don't want him to be the Messiah because they are quite happy with things as they are now. They have power, limited, controlled by the Romans, but they have power, they have money, they have influence. They don't want a Messiah. They want the status quo. They want things to stay as they are. So they're not really interested, and Jesus knows this. It's important to realize, as Tom Wright, the theologian, says, through all the misunderstandings and blunderings of these trials, God's purpose was going forward. This it was indeed how God's kingdom was to come. You see, Jesus is the one really in control. Not the Sanhedrin or Pilate or Herod. So the Sanhedrin asks him this question, is he the Messiah? So he answers with this really clever answer. Too often, when we are confronted with challenging questions, we blunder into, and I've done it myself, the most an unhelpful answer. Jesus answers really cleverly. Because you see, if he'd said yes, then he was saying yes to a very different type of Messiah. Because he wasn't coming as that military leader. He wasn't coming as that person to kick the Romans out. He was coming with a very different type of kingdom. But equally, he couldn't say no because he is the Messiah. So he answers, seeing straight into their hearts. He sees straight into their false questioning and says, well, if I tell you, you won't believe me. And if I asked you, you wouldn't answer. In other words, if I say yes, you won't believe me. And if I say, well, what do you think? You're not going to answer that question. So it's a really shrewd answer. But then, because he is in control and he knows this is not about getting him off the charges and getting him released. Because Jesus knows God's plan is the cross. So therefore, Jesus says this. He says, from now on, the Son of Man will be seated at the right hand of the mighty God. This takes things to a very different level. No longer is he talking about being a political leader or being misunderstood as a political leader. He's claiming something that the Sanhedrin see very clearly. Because they ask, are you then the Son of God? So in other words, have you moved from a human leader to, are you now saying you're God? That's blasphemy in their eyes. It would be blasphemy if it wasn't for the fact it's true. He is the Son of God. And so he answers, in one of those answers, throughout the scriptures in these trials, you see Jesus using this phrase, you say that I am. He doesn't come out clearly with yes, but he says, you say that I am, and that's enough for them to say, right, he's blaspheming. This is a death penalty. This is something we can get him on. So off they go, and they take him to the next part. And now we move on into chapter 23, and we move to Pilate's palace in the story. And we see verse 1 onwards of chapter 23 says, then the whole assembly rose and led him off to Pilate. And they began to accuse him, saying, we have found this man subverting our nation. He opposes paying taxes to Caesar and claims to be Messiah, a king. Let's pause there for a moment. First of all, there's a lie. He never opposed paying taxes to Caesar. In fact, actually, if you remember, he directly says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's. He actually encourages them to pay their taxes. So that's an outright lie. And then they also say, and claims to be Messiah. Now, that word Messiah is irrelevant to Pilate. But king, now that's a different matter. Because now suddenly they've used a word that means something to Pilate. This means he's rebellious. He's a rebel. He's a usurper. He's out to get rid of the Romans. That becomes an interest to Pilate. So let's move on. So Pilate asked Jesus, are you the king of the Jews? You have said so. That phrase again. Jesus replied. Then Pilate announced to the chief priests and the crowd, I find no basis for a charge against this man. But they insisted, he stirs up the people all over Judea by his teaching. He started in Galilee and has come all the way here. On hearing this, Pilate asked if the man was a Galilean. When he learned that Jesus was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him to Herod, who was also in Jerusalem at that time. So you see, Pilate recognizes that Jesus is not this guerrilla leader of an army to be raised up against the Romans. He can see that that's not who Jesus is. He doesn't really know who Jesus is, but he can see he's not this rebel leader. And he's going, well, look, I don't want to get caught up in your strange goings on. I'm going to release him. It doesn't nothing to do with me. And they keep pushing him. They say he's rousing crowds up. And then they drop in the phrase that he's from Galilee. And Pilate, because Pilate is a weak man, ultimately we'll see that Pilate is not a strong leader. And he's a weak man, and he sees Galilee and thinks, Herod, I can palm him off on Herod, and Herod can do the dirty work on deciding on this guy, because Herod was ruler of Galilee. They were both, neither of them lived in Jerusalem, Pilate nor Herod. Herod lived up in Galilee. Pilate usually lived in Caesarea, and they'd both come to Jerusalem for the Passover festival. So off Jesus gets dragged to Herod, and we see Herod. Now, Herod is a bit, in one sense, a comical character. I don't know if you know the Andrew Lloyd Webber musical, Jesus Christ Superstar. It was in Cardiff recently. Roz and I went and saw it, a really great production of that story of the last few days of Jesus' life. And there's a song that King Herod sings. It's one of the only upbeat songs in the movie, in the musical. And it's all about, Jesus, will you do these miracles? Change my water into wine. Walk across my swimming pool. You can do it. Because this comical character of Herod is only interested in show. And that is 100% accurate to the scriptural story. I wouldn't say that everything in the musical is 100% accurate, but this is exactly who Herod is. Let's read from verse 8. It says, when Herod saw Jesus, he was greatly pleased, because for a long time he'd been wanting to see him. From what he had heard about him, he hoped to see him perform a sign of some sort. He plied him with many questions, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the teachers of the law were standing there, vehemently accusing him. Then Herod and his soldiers ridiculed and mocked him. Dressing him in an elegant robe, they sent him back to Pilate. That day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. It's interesting to note in this that this is the only part of the trial where Jesus says nothing. Because you see, Jesus is not interested in show and sham and spectacle. He's not bothered. He doesn't say a word to Herod. He simply stands there. He's not going to give in to this fool's desire for a spectacle, for a show to be put on. He's not some form of magician. That's not what Jesus is about, so he just stays silent. And Herod goes mad because he's not giving him what he wants. So he wraps him up in a robe to mock him and sends him back to Pilate, where we get to the final part of the story. It says, Pilate called together the chief priests, the rulers, and the people, and said to them, you brought me this man as one who was inciting the people to rebellion. I've examined him in your presence, and I've found no basis for your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. As you can see, he has done nothing to deserve death. Therefore I will punish him and then release him. But the whole crowd shouted, away with this man, release Barabbas to us. Barabbas had been thrown into prison for an insurrection in the city and for murder. Wanting to release Jesus, Pilate appealed to them again, but they kept shouting, crucify him, crucify him. For the third time he spoke to them. Why? What crime has this man committed? I have found in him no grounds for the death penalty. Therefore I will have him punished and then release him. But with loud shouts, they insistently demanded that he be crucified, and their shouts prevailed. So Pilate decided to grant their demand. He released the man who had been thrown into prison for insurrection and murder, and the one they asked for, and surrendered Jesus to their will. Ultimately, Pilate is a weak leader. He doesn't have the strength of character to stand up. Pilate clearly knows that Jesus is innocent of the trumped-up charges. He's out of his depth and he's confused. He doesn't understand the intricacies of Jewish theology, and all he can see is what looks to him like a sad and deluded man. He finally caves in and gives what they want: a crucifixion for Jesus and the release of the person that was the real rebel, an insurrectionist, Barabbas. Interestingly, Barabbas' name means son of the Father. Interesting. You see, Jesus is in control of these situations. It doesn't feel like it. It doesn't look like it. But there is a different kingdom at work. We can see that from the triumphal entry through to these trials, Jesus wields his power completely differently, to the point where you could talk about the kingdom of heaven being an upside-down kingdom, completely the opposite of the way the world operates, where we see how Jesus is so violently different. So I've pulled together a bit of a table on the screen. There we go. About the differences between the earthly kingdoms and the kingdom of God. You see, for the kingdom of this world, power and control is at the heart of the kingdoms. But for Jesus, it is service and servant-heartedness. For the world's powers, it is about self-interest, about me, me, me. But for Jesus, it is sacrifice for the sake of others. For the earthly kingdoms, it is unruliness and disorderliness. The Roman Empire was one of the most controlled and controlling empires ever to exist. And yet, most of its existence was about putting down rebellions and things, and uprisings. Unruliness and disorderliness is at the heart of much of the world's powers, but for Jesus, it's about self-control. For the world, it is about division. It is about hatred and suspicion. But for Jesus, it is about unity, love, and trust. I don't know if about you, but if you look around at the world today, that is how I see the world's kingdoms. And this is not a political thing about particular people or parties. They're all as bad as one another in that sense. The worldly powers do not have the answer. Only Jesus has the answer. The kingdom of God is the answer. Thank you. Yes. I read sorry to the slide guys, I'm jumping around a little bit. But I read a quote by Pastor Greg Laurie, who's a pastor in America. And he said this. He said, we're in a political season. Obviously, America has got elections this year, the same as we have. He says, we're in a political season right now, and we should all vote, by the way. Every Christian should register and vote. But don't put your hope in political solutions. Only God can change the human heart. Only God can turn our nation around. And that would require a spiritual awakening. We should all be praying for that. You see, the kingdoms of this world do not have the answers the world needs. They are appointed. They serve under God's authority to administrate the world, but they don't have the answer to the world. Only Jesus and the kingdom of heaven has the answers. Let me just give a little warning as we come in towards the end of this message. In verse 12, there's that strange verse that says, that day Herod and Pilate became friends. Before this, they had been enemies. It's a bit of a strange verse. What it says is that it's dangerous when religion and faith and political power are too closely intertwined. We've seen that so often around the world, where religion and politics and power get too close. It's often difficult for people of faith to speak truth to power if you're too closely aligned to that power. It's a dangerous act. Yes, we are called to submit to earthly authorities. We're called to pray for our leaders. We even see examples in the lives of people such as Daniel, of people who engage and get stuck into the leading and governing of countries. But we serve a greater kingdom. And there are times when we have a greater calling. When we are calling. So those verses in Acts are when the apostles were told by the authorities to stop preaching the gospel. And they said, we can't because we serve a greater kingdom. Yeah. This is an important year for governments and around the world. There's a map coming up. It's a slightly grainy map, but you can see. And the important thing is the amount of red on that map of the world. Over 50 countries and almost half the world's population will be voting in national elections in 2024. Some of those are freer and fairer elections than others. And there are elections around the world with many countries represented in this room having elections, be it the US, South Africa, India, and of course, the UK. We need to pray for our leaders. We need to speak truth to those in power. But we also need to make sure that we are aware that none of them have the final answer. Let me ask you a question. You may say, but I'm not involved in government, I'm not involved in politics and all this sort of stuff. What does this mean for me? Well, we all engage with the powers of this world, with the authorities of this world, whether that's in your daily work, whether that's in your studies. These are all the systems of this world. We operate in an opposite spirit. We operate in a spirit that isn't a spirit of hatred, division, and distrust. We operate in a system of unity, love, trust. We serve. We don't expect people to serve us. We are not interested in power. We're interested in serving people and sacrifice. That is the way of Jesus. How do you respond when you are faced with power and abuse and people pushing too much of their earthly power towards you? Do you respond in the same way? Do you respond in the way the earthly authorities would expect, or do you operate in an opposite spirit? Tom Wright, again, great theologian, just published a book called Jesus and the Powers, and he says this in that book, says, the Christian vocation is neither pious longing for heaven, nor scheming to make Jesus king by exerting force over unwilling subjects. Instead, Christians should be ready to speak truth to power, being concerned with the righteous exercise of government, seeing it bent towards the arc of justice, and fulfilling the service that God expects of governing authorities. Our job is to hold those governing us to account, to make sure they're doing the right thing. How do we respond? I'm going to invite the band back on the platform. We're going to worship one more time in song before we close. There's a great prayer that is allegedly was written by St. Francis of Assisi, although actually it's highly unlikely it was. It was probably written many hundreds of years later. But it's a prayer that sums up how he responded to the world that was throwing things against him. And he prayed, Lord, make me an instrument of your peace. Where there is hatred, let me sow love. Where there is injury, pardon. Where there is doubt, faith. Where there is despair, hope. Where there is darkness, light. Where there is sadness, joy. Wouldn't that be great if that was how we as a church responded to the world around us? Where there is hatred, let us sow love. Where there is injury, let us give forgiveness. Where there is doubt, let us sow faith. Despair, let us show hope. Darkness, let us be light. Sadness, let us bring joy. I'm really struck by that final sentence. Perhaps you're here today and actually you look and you think, the world around me, my world, is full of sadness. We can all, in one sense, say that every time we switch the news on, there is never anything happy or joyous, or rarely. There's a lot of sadness in our world. Our calling as a church, it's above my head on the banners, is to bring hope in the name of Jesus. Wouldn't it be great if you're sitting in work or in college or at home or with friends and they say, isn't it all terrible what's going on around the world? And it is. But there is hope. And his name is Jesus. And he heads a different type of kingdom. A kingdom that includes, not excludes. A kingdom that welcomes, not turns away. A kingdom that is full of joy and light and hope.